Welcome to the Humanities Challenge, where you choose where we go next and I have to try to make sense of it all. The comment with the most likes when this video hits 50 likes will be the topic of the next episode. So comment with your favorite thinker, writer, idea, book, piece of art, anything in the humanities, and it will be a candidate for the next episode. This episode is going to be about Plato. This will give me the best shot at connecting this episode to whatever you decide the next episode will be about, because, as Alfred North Whitehead famously said, the safest characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. And if Alfred says it, it must be true. Plato is actually a nickname. His real name is Aristocles, which is still a pretty cool name. The Greek word Platon means broad, which either reflects the man's broad stature or his broad scope of knowledge. Plato wasn't the first philosopher, but he was the best philosopher. Put that in your Philosophy 101 paper and cite this video. Before him, philosophers largely focused on ontology and cosmology, that is, what everything is made up of and how it got here. These folks were called the pre-Socratics, and I linked a video of them in the description. Plato expanded the scope of philosophy considerably to include pretty much anything that's typically considered relevant in the field today. He did this mostly by writing dialogues, which featured his teacher, Socrates. The exceptions include a few letters and a super long dialogue called The Laws, which did not feature Socrates, but rather a man known as the Athenian stranger. Suspicious. Since most of his dialogues feature Socrates, the question arises, shouldn't we be crediting Socrates rather than Plato for all these ideas? The short answer is no. The long answer is that scholars often divide Plato's works into three chronological eras, often labeled early, middle, and late. The early dialogues tend to reflect Socrates' thoughts much better than the middle and the late. But even those early dialogues are not one-to-one representations of Socrates' thoughts. So to get a broad sense of the man's work, let's take a sample from each of these three periods and discuss some of the highlights of each. Early. The Gorgias is a dialogue between Socrates and three men. Two rhetoricians, Polus and Gorgias, and a third guy who nobody likes called Callicles. Lots of Platonic dialogues focus on rhetoric or sophistry. First, because rhetoric was very important in Athenian political life, and second, because Socrates was often accused of being a sophist. This dialogue assesses the value of rhetoric with Gorgias, a famous rhetorician, and his student Polus. Contrary to popular opinion, Socrates does not believe that rhetoric is essentially good, nor particularly helpful. This is seen as absurd to the two men who can hardly think of something more important than rhetoric. While these men are good at rhetoric, giving speeches, they are far less formidable in dialectic, which is discussion. So Socrates trips them up often and causes them to contradict themselves, all while managing to communicate that far from being a tool to protect oneself from justice, rhetoric is best used to actually accuse oneself in the court of law. Justice in this dialogue is described as a good and helpful thing, one that criminals should seek for their own reform. This is too much for Callicles, who interjects and is willing to say the hard things that the other two are too shy to say. He too gets verbally beat up, and this leads to one of the most powerful parables in all of Plato's work. I'll link a longer video on that below. Middle. Plato's most popular dialogue is the Republic, and for good reason. Artistically, it's the most well integrated into its plot, and it's also full of subtle points and Easter eggs. Here, Socrates is tasked with defending justice. Most people of his day believe that justice is nice for keeping bad people at bay, but when it comes to them personally, it's not so great. These folks think that it would be really nice if they could safely do whatever they wanted with no consequence. They want to be unjust. Socrates is asked to take two people, a just man who has an awful life and an unjust man who lives like a king, and prove that the just man is happier. Naturally, the only way to do that is to build a fictional city from the ground up, and this is what Socrates does through the next 8 parts of the book. The book contains some of Plato's most famous ideas, such as the theory of forms, the ring of Gyges, and the noble lie. The Republic is a great read. Late. I wanted to include the Critias in this brief summary because of its difference from the other two. This book follows an ancient chronology of geography, divine actions, global floods, and the mythical city of Atlantis. The Atlanteans were descendants of Poseidon, and they were good and noble people for a long time, but over time, however, they became corrupted. This caused Zeus to get involved. Sadly, we don't know what happens from here. We're missing the rest of the text. I wanted to include this one here because it includes some of the stuff you'd expect from ancient Greek texts like Homer or the other poets. It's ambitious in its mythological assertions, and it gives us some good places to connect Plato to his contemporaries and predecessors in poetry. Plato's influence can't be overstated. Without him, there would likely be no Aristotle, nor Alexander the Great. The Hellenistic schools, such as the Stoics, the Epicureans, would look different, and worst of all, what would become of Alfred North Whitehead? See you in episode 2.